If you like stories about King Arthur, or you happen to be from Edinburgh, you may have heard of a character called Loth of Lothian. Lothian is the region around Edinburgh in Scotland. Modern boundaries divide it into West Lothian, the city of Edinburgh, Mid Lothian, and East Lothian. That's why people also say the Lothians, plural, which means much the same thing. Lothian is an ancient name, and the story goes that the Lothians are named after a king Lot, or Loth, who ruled from a great fortress on a hill called Traprain Law. Traprain Law in East Lothian may have been the area's first capital. There was once a fortified settlement there which amounted to a small city. Traprain Law is also known as Dunpelder, Fort of the Spears, or Dumpender. It's particularly associated with Loth, but the story isn't a simple one. The law itself is an old volcanic plug, not unlike the one Edinburgh Castle sits on. Fortresses were built on heights like this over a long stretch of prehistory, and Traprain is considered to be one of the most important in Scotland. Its period of occupation may have spanned over 1,000 years. Traprain is linked to the people who Ptolemy called the Votadini, who were later known as the Gododdin. The exact extent of their territory is unclear. It probably started around the head of the Firth of Forth and ran south to somewhere beyond the modern-day English-Scottish border. At its height, Traprain Law must have been like a fortified city and possibly home to the royal court of the Votadini Gododdin. Up to 40 acres were once enclosed by its ramparts. A big hoard of late Roman hack silver was found at Traprain. One theory is that the Romans were using silver objects cut into specific weights to pay the Gododdin what amounted to protection money. It's not clear how the Gododdin organized themselves politically. Was there a kind of high king who ruled from Edinburgh or maybe Traprain? Or was the kingdom of the Gododdin divided into smaller territories with different chieftains at Edinburgh, Traprain, and perhaps elsewhere? The area around the River Forth was once called Manaw Gododdin. Manaw Gododdin may have included Dalmeny and parts of West Lothian, Clackamanan, and possibly Stirling. Manaw may have originally been an independent kingdom which was later acquired by the Gododdin. However the Gododdin ruled themselves, they seem to have been major players in the north of their day. Of course, the Gododdin are also famous because legend has it that in the early 7th century, 300 Gododdin warriors died in a kind of suicide mission when they made a brave but ill-considered attack on the stronghold of Catrice, now known as Catterick in North Yorkshire. This was commemorated in a beautiful poem also known as the Gododdin, a series of elegies for the individual warriors who died in the battle. However, that fight was a little after Loth's time. Near the foot of Traprain Law there's a stone called the Loth Stone. According to tradition, it used to mark the burial place of King Loth. I say used to mark because the archaeological record shows that it was moved to its present location in the early 20th century. King Loth is said to have had his stronghold on Traprain Law. There's a tale of how he was killed by a swineherd who he accused of impregnating his daughter. The tradition that the Loth Stone commemorates the burial of an elite individual may well be correct. There are accounts in the archaeological record that it marked the location of some stone coffins or maybe a kist burial, meaning some kind of stone-lined grave. Not this one, but perhaps something similar. That grave seems to have been lost to the plough, and so it can't be dated, and some of the records concerning it got lost in the Second World War. So what do we know about Loth? It seems like Loth, and that may not have been his name, or at least not exactly, must have lived in the 6th century. That was a time when the Romans were long gone, and the Angles and Saxons were becoming an increasing problem for the native Britons. At the same time, people from Ireland, confusingly called Scots, were beginning to move into what is now southwestern Scotland in increasing numbers. To understand the evidence I'm going to present, it might help to understand a bit more about where that evidence comes from and how it reached us. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. You can find out more about them at the link which is on your screen now. You can also support my work on Ko-fi or by becoming a patron. You'll also find free content to read on my Patreon page and on my website. All the links are in the description. What is now northern England and southern Scotland was once home to a rich and vibrant heroic culture. This was a mix of regions and their famous kings, and it seems to have reflected a touch of pre-Roman and pre-Christian mystery onto the early post-Roman reality. The Welsh later came to call this time and place Hen Ogledd, the Old North. The period most written about is the 6th century. Stories have survived in the native tradition, some of them carried from poets who may have been eyewitnesses, such as Taliesin, who served Adrian of Lleged as his court poet, and Adrian, who wrote about the disastrous defeat of the Gododdin at Catraeth. There are stories about Adrian's greatness as a war leader and about his son Owain, who killed an Anglian king in battle. There are many tales and references to Adrian from the Welsh scribes and poets. Brother Kyle of Strathclyde is known as a contemporary of Adrian and as a supporter of St. Kentigern, the first bishop of Glasgow. Cunan ap Cludno of Edinburgh is mentioned repeatedly in Aneirin's poetry about the Gododdin, and may have been one of the few survivors of the expedition to Catraeth. Some of this is history, but much of it is legend. Scholars are still arguing about which is which. A legend is a story that has some basis in history. It involves people who really lived and probably did great things, but their stories have grown and become a bit confused in the telling. Hen Ogledd became a place of legend for the medieval Welsh, harkening back to a time when the north was still Brythonic, and there seemed to be some hope of beating back the tide of Germanic settlement there. The stories of the men of the Old North are hard to parse. We don't have any original documentation. The bards of Britain, who seem to have carried on the legacy of the Druids before them, were great lore keepers. Their early lives were devoted to memorizing poetry, stories, and genealogies. It's likely that at least some of the stories they preserved really happened, but at this distance, it's difficult to know which ones. The great men of the North were revered as heroes and mythologized almost as if they were gods at times. They're sometimes said to have had supernatural adventures or done things that seemed impossible. So that's the world in which Loth is placed by legend. But was he really called Loth? There are several candidates for who Loth of Lothian might have been, or what he might have been called. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his so-called History of the Kings of Britain, called him Loth of Leudonia. Geoffrey's writing was influential, and it's often tricky to work out whether later evidence about things is influenced by his work, which is mostly fiction. Loth of Lothian is how he's known in later folklore, and the popular story is that the Lothians are named after him, although another theory is that the Lothians already had their name, and that Loth was made up later, perhaps by Geoffrey of Monmouth, to explain the name Lothian. Geoffrey also called him Lot of Norway, and later Arthurian writers called him Lot of Orkney. More on that shortly. An anonymous monk writing in Glasgow called him Leudonus of Leudonia, while early Welsh sources speak of Lleu, Lleu, or Lleudan of Lluddiniaun, the Welsh name for Lothian. Some of these make him the brother of Adrian of Lleged. The Lot of Lothian found in Arthurian stories originates with Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey is really the start of the King Arthur, Merlin, and Morgan Le Fay literary industry. A Norman churchman with an eye for the main chance, modern scholars note that he had a habit of producing new literary works, such as the History of Britain or the Life of Merlin, whenever he thought he might be up for promotion to a better post in the church. Geoffrey's lot is initially called Loth of Lothian, Lothian just being a fancy Latin form of Lothian. As a loyal supporter of Arthur, Lot is given Arthur's sister Anna as a wife, and later becomes king of Norway. Geoffrey also gives Lot two brothers. One is called Agiselus, the other Euryanus. Euryanus is obviously based on Adrian of Reged. We can be reasonably certain that Adrian, who probably died around 590, and any brothers he had, would have lived at least a generation or two later than a historical Arthur. For centuries, people believed that Geoffrey's history of the kings of Britain was an actual history. But Geoffrey's work constantly places prominent characters from the Old North, like satellites around Arthur, bringing them into the story as his knights, allies, and enemies, without any real concern for historical reality. We have to remember that he's writing 600 or 700 years after the events, and like many modern writers of historical fiction, he doesn't see being out of sync by a mere century as a problem. Later developers of the Arthurian genre, like Chrétien de Troyes and Thomas Malory, added to Lot's storyline, but those details probably have no basis in history or even in native British legends. Lot merely becomes a cast member in their literary dramas. Why did Geoffrey connect Lot to Norway? The name Ljot wasn't unusual in medieval Norway. There was no king of Norway called Lot, as Geoffrey suggests, but there were at least two famous Ljots in the 10th century. In the anonymous Icelandic saga Egil's Saga, a Swedish berserker called Ljot the Pale wreaked great havoc in Norway before finally being killed by the Viking poet Egil Skallagrimsson. I suppose it's possible that some news of this reached Wales in the ensuing 200 years. Around the same time, one Ljot Thorfinnsson, son of an Orkney Earl Thorfinn Skullsplitter, became Earl of Orkney and Caithness, winning considerable fame as a fighter in northern Scotland. Over the border in Sutherland, there's a Glen Loth, which just might be named for Earl Ljot. There are several standing stones there too, but they're likely to be well before his time. Ljot is not our man. He belongs to the Viking culture of northern Scotland, not the Brythonic culture of the south. Even if his story didn't influence Geoffrey, it probably encouraged later writers of Arthurian tales to associate Geoffrey's lot with Orkney and northern Scotland. The history of the kings of Britain is as much a flight of fancy built around famous names as it is actual history. But there are many unanswered questions about Geoffrey's sources, most of which would probably have come from Wales or possibly Brittany. If he had such sources, we can't identify them, and there's always the temptation to believe Geoffrey of Monmouth when his ideas fit our own theories, and to discard his writing when they don't. Many modern scholars suggest that Geoffrey invented King Loth of Lothian based on his tendency to name kings after their kingdoms. However, as we shall see, things aren't quite that simple. A decade or two after Geoffrey wrote his history, a Glasgow bishop called Herbert commissioned a hagiography of St. Kentigern. Kentigern, the patron saint of Glasgow, is also known as St. Mungo. Only part of that text has survived. Like the history of the kings of Britain, the so-called fragmentary life of St. Kentigern was written in Latin, but this author gives Lot the name Leudonus and calls him the king of Leudonia. These names are much closer to the forms Llyddin and Lleudiniaun used in Welsh, and the author seems to have had good knowledge of Lothian and its lore. The text begins by describing Leudonus as a half-pagan king who has a daughter called Thani. Thani is courted by none other than Lleu, son of Erwagendi, in other words, Owain, son of Adrian. However, Thani refuses his advances, preferring to remain a holy virgin. Desperate, Lleu takes her by trickery in the hope that if she experiences the joy of union, she'll change her mind. The couple are portrayed as extremely naive. Neither of them believe that their quick fumble could have caused Thani's pregnancy, and Leudonus blames his swineherd for the deed. The swineherd, fearing for his life, throws a spear at Leudonus, killing him. The author goes on to describe how Leudonus' friends erected the Loth Stone in his memory. Was there really a Leudonus, or Lleu, as the Welsh came to call him? It's hard to be sure, but we can rule out Geoffrey of Monmouth as the source of this story. He never mentioned anything like that. However, versions of this tale circulated in Scotland over many centuries, and a variation of it provides the underlying theme of Chrétien de Troyes' Yvain, Knight of the Lion, the Welsh romance Owain, or the Lady of the Fountain, and the romance Fergus of Galloway. Chrétien even names Yvain's romantic interest as the daughter of Duke Laudonais. You can hear about how these stories are related in another of my videos, which I'll link at the end. The Lady of the Fountain, Yvain, and the story of Kentigern's conception by Owain of Reged and the daughter of Leudonus all come from the mid-12th century. It's impossible to know whether any of the authors were aware of each other's works. The three stories have many things in common and even more differences. This suggests that there may have been a legend concerning Owain and the daughter of the King of Lothian which influenced them all. I'm not ready to hazard a guess as to what that story would look like, but it might have had something to do with sovereignty being transferred from one king to another. Interestingly, in the Welsh version, Owain's friend and the instigator of the adventure is Hen Ogledd. Although he's presented primarily as a knight of Arthur in The Lady of the Fountain, which makes no historical sense, according to Welsh lore he was the son of a Gododdin ruler based in Edinburgh. Since the Old North was still Brythonic speaking at the time of Kentigern, Owain, and Adrian, let's see what Welsh sources have to say. Geoffrey of Monmouth's history was wildly popular. Many copies were made, and it was soon translated from Latin into Welsh. These Welsh versions, known as Brut de Brenhinedd, began to appear in the early 13th century. Welsh translators, of course, did their best to put names back into their Welsh forms, rather than use Geoffrey's awkward Latin versions. Wherever Geoffrey speaks of Eurianus and his brothers Augusellus and Lot, the Welsh redactors amend this to Adrian, Arawn, and Lleu or Lleu. While these names are certainly more Welsh, they don't appear in any genealogies or stories as brothers of Adrian until about 1470 in a famous triad known as the Three Fair Womburdens, or multiple births, of the island of Britain. The names Arawn and Lleu are interesting in that they're both names found in the four branches of the Mabinogi, where they belong to characters who are supernatural in one way or another. Arawn is an otherworldly king dwelling in Annuvin, while Lleu is a slightly tragic character surrounded by the magic of others. Neither of these figures appear in stories or poems about Adrian. An earlier form of the same triad says that Adrian and his twin sister Evrithel are the Womburdin. This may be the stronger tradition, as Evrithel is mentioned again in the same triad, and in a poem where she mourns the death of her brother. The odds of Adrian really having brothers by these names are pretty low. They aren't mentioned in genealogies concerning Adrian and his ancestors. Lot or Lleu probably wasn't Adrian's brother. Another possibility is Lleudan Lithog, which means Lleudan of the hosts, suggesting the leader of an army, maybe a king. He's actually just Leudonus by his Welsh name. The earliest text we have about him is in a late 14th century genealogy called Bonedd y Saint, the genealogy of the saints, which gives the genealogy of Kentigern this way: Kenderin Garthwys, son of Owain, son of Adrian, and of Denu, daughter of Lleudan Lithog, of Dinas Aidan in the north, his mother. Of course, this is likely to be based on the Glasgow hagiography of Kentigern that we've already looked at, and the main thing it gives us is a Brythonic name for Loth of Lothian. The Lothians are still called Lleudiniaun in Welsh. That name means country of the fortress of Lleu, or Lugus. Lleu is an early Welsh expression of the Celtic deity Lugus, and Din means fortress. The same issue pertains here. Is the territory named after the ruler, or was he created to explain its name later? All the forms of the name Lugus are a little problematic to translate, having possible connotations of both light and brightness on the one hand, and oath-swearing on the other. So the name Lleu could mean something like Bright Fortress or Fortress of the Oath. Kind of an odd name for a king, but not impossible. But there's one more piece of evidence. Let's roll right back to the 7th century, the time of the Gododdin's battle at Catraeth, and the manuscript called the Book of Adrian, which contains those elegies for the fallen. It includes a stanza which doesn't always get translated because the language is a bit obscure, but John Koch and T.M. Charles Edwards have both translated it fairly recently. The rock of Lleu's tribe, or Lleu's people. The rock could be Edinburgh, or it could be Traprain Law. We know that Ljots means country of the fortress of Lleu, or even the people of the fortress of Lleu. Whether you choose to interpret that as Lleu, the reflex of the god Lugus, or a man called Lleu, this gives us a much earlier reference to Loth of Lothian, or Lleu of Ljots, from around the 7th century. And Lleu is a more plausible personal name, I think, than Lleu, fortress of Lleu. Perhaps Lothian has been dedicated to Lugus in one form or another ever since Celtic speakers first arrived there. If Lothian is named for Lleu, or Lugus, it does seem like the area around Traprain Law may be the centre of things. The presence of the Lugus Burn watercourse nearby seems to add weight to that, although the origin of Lugus isn't certain. Forts dedicated to Lugus and his reflexes are widespread. For example, Carlisle just over the Scottish border in Cumbria, Dinas in Lleu in North Wales, and Lyon in France. The list of other places associated with Lugus includes Glen Lyon and possibly Glen Loth in Scotland, Louth in Ireland, and many others. I know some of you have been waiting for me to reach this conclusion since the video started, but I don't think the answer is quite so facile. It's possible that Lleudan Leidog, or Leudonus, is a name created out of Lleudiniaun, the country of Lleu's fort. But it's a bit surprising that this name is used to explain both the Loth Stone and the conception of St. Kentigern. If the Loth Stone is associated with the lost kist burial nearby, then it's most likely to be Bronze Age or Iron Age. Other than the probably non-existent brother of Adrian, Lleu doesn't seem to have been a name given to individuals in the Brythonic period. So maybe this whole story reflects a myth of the tutelary deity of Lothian. Just as Lleudan is killed with a spear by the swineherd, both Lleu in the Irish tradition and Lleu in the Mabinogi are killed, or nearly so, by being pierced by a spear. Both of those stories involve an altercation with a rival over Lleu or Lleu's wife. In Lleudan's case, it's not his wife, but his daughter who's at the center of the feud. But both wives and daughters can be sovereignty figures, potentially bestowing kingship on the man who wins them. Is this the root of all these stories involving Owain? Is he essentially the young hero attempting to gain possession of the local female sovereignty figure, whether mortal or immortal? I'm not suggesting that these stories are all the same. Chrétien's Duke Laudonais is a far cry from Lleu Lavada, but perhaps all these stories contain echoes of an earlier myth which still loosely ties them together. In that sense at least, Loth of Lothian does represent Lugus. The rest is a rich mix of folklore and legend, behind which lies a myth we can only guess at. But wait, so who was buried under the Loth Stone? While I think we've established that this is an open question, complete with missing archaeology, why do people believe this was Loth's grave? Well, I can't answer that. It's interesting that near the hill of Uisneach in Ireland is a loch called Loch Lleu, where the god Lleu was said to have been drowned after his enemies put a spear through his foot. Nearby is Carnlugnach, which is said to be his burial place. Archaeologists can see that it is a burial place, but again, the archaeology isn't clear, it's too disturbed. Could there once have been kings or priests who took on the name of Lugus at these royal sites dedicated to him? It's a tantalizing thought. A more prosaic answer might be that fortresses dedicated to Lugus would naturally attract elite burials, and over time these would be said to be graves of the namesake of the site. Some of us can never believe a legend. We want proof, and some of us prefer to believe them all because they contain a kind of truth.